In the brutal winter of 1609 in Jamestown, desperate English colonists were reduced to eating boots, rats, snakes, and even worse as famine gripped the settlement. Out of roughly 500 people, only about 60 survived the starving time. Not because they were lazy, but because they faced starvation, deadly diseases, and utter despair. Yet these ordinary English men, women, and children somehow turned that near-death experience into the foundation of what would become America. Imagine frozen rivers cutting off supplies, disease-ridden ships arriving with more mouths than food, endless dangerous forests, shifting alliances and conflicts with Native Americans, and the constant threat of death on the Oregon Trail-like journeys that followed. Would you have survived even one such winter in 1607 America? Early Americans, referring to the English colonists who established Jamestown in 1607 and Plymouth in 1620 along with the later pioneers driving westward expansion in the 1700s and 1800s, came seeking profit through ventures like the Virginia Company, religious freedom as with the Pilgrims fleeing persecution, and opportunities for land ownership. These settlements faced extreme hardships, with many experiencing death rates exceeding 50 to 80% in the first year due to disease, starvation, and harsh conditions, such as Jamestown's starving time, that reduced hundreds to just dozens of survivors, and nearly half the Mayflower passengers perishing in their initial winter. A quick timeline shows the progression from Jamestown's founding to the Mayflower's arrival and onward to the Oregon Trail migrations. Ultimately, survival was no accident but resulted from brutal adaptation, incorporating native knowledge for food and survival techniques, raw willpower, and hard lessons from repeated deadly mistakes, all while crossing the Atlantic and carving out East Coast footholds. The deadly voyage across the Atlantic lasted 8 to 12 weeks on cramped wooden ships, where passengers endured scurvy from lack of fresh food, spoiled provisions crawling with maggots, constant seasickness, violent storms that threatened to sink vessels, and unimaginable overcrowding with little privacy or sanitation. Upon arrival, the harsh reality hit hard. The so-called New World was no empty paradise but a wilderness of dense forests, disease-ridden swamps, swarms of mosquitoes carrying malaria and other illnesses, and zero existing infrastructure, forcing settlers to build everything from scratch in a completely unfamiliar environment. In Jamestown, Virginia, the warmer climate offered a longer growing season but brought deadly humidity, brackish water, and mosquito-borne diseases that contributed to massive death tolls. In contrast, Plymouth in Massachusetts faced a brutal cold winter with freezing temperatures, deep snow, and shorter summers, making food scarcity even more severe. A vivid account from George Percy, an early Jamestown settler, captured the misery. "Our drink cold water, full of slime and filth." These first shocks tested every ounce of human endurance right from the moment they stepped off the ships. In the first months after landing, the early Americans had no proper shelter and lived in makeshift tents, caves, or shallow holes dug into the ground, leaving them completely exposed to freezing temperatures, rain, and snow that caused many to die from hypothermia and exposure during the brutal first winters. Building anything better required relentless, backbreaking labor with just basic tools like axes and saws to fell trees, notch logs, and haul heavy timber. They eventually constructed log cabins, a technique they learned from Swedish and Finnish settlers and adapted with help from Native American knowledge. On the open prairies farther west, pioneers built sod houses by cutting thick blocks of prairie grass and stacking them like bricks. For insulation, they chinked gaps between logs with mud mixed with grass, used thatched roofs from reeds or straw, and draped animal hides over walls and floors. During the coldest nights, families shared body heat by sleeping close together and warmed their beds with hot rocks heated in the fire. Early shelters often lacked proper fireplaces, filling the tiny spaces with choking smoke. The most tragic example was Plymouth's first winter, when nearly half the colonists perished from cold, disease, and starvation before spring arrived. These improvised shelters marked the difference between life and death in those deadly early days. In the early colonies, starvation proved to be the #1 killer, far deadlier than battles or wild animals. The most infamous episode was Jamestown's starving time during the winter of 1609 to 1610, when food ran out completely. Desperate settlers ate their horses, dogs, rats, snakes, and even boiled their leather boots for nourishment. Archaeological evidence discovered in 2012 confirmed cases of cannibalism, including the remains of a young English girl whose bones showed clear-cut marks from butchering. Initial farming attempts failed miserably because the colonists planted European crops like wheat in unsuitable soil and climate, lacking the knowledge to clear land or manage native conditions. The turning point came through Native American help. Tribes like the Powhatan taught the Jamestown settlers, while Squanto guided the Pilgrims in Plymouth to plant corn, beans, and squash together using the clever Three Sisters method, where the plants supported each other and enriched the soil. Natives also shared vital fishing and hunting techniques. As time went on, pioneers relied on flintlock rifles and traps for game, and they perfected pemmican, a high-energy superfood made from dried meat mixed with berries and fat that could last for months. Finding safe drinking water was another constant battle. Rivers were often salty or contaminated with bacteria, so settlers learned to dig wells and always boil water before drinking. Later pioneers on the Oregon Trail faced similar hardships, carefully rationing limited supplies, hunting massive buffalo herds when possible, and mastering desert water-finding tricks like following animal trails or digging in dry riverbeds. One major economic breakthrough that helped save Jamestown was John Rolfe's successful cultivation of tobacco, which became a profitable cash crop and brought much-needed trade and supplies from England. These hard-won lessons in food and water turned the tide from certain death to survival for many. Disease acted as a silent killer that claimed far more lives than warfare or starvation in the early years. New arrivals suffered terribly during the seasoning period, when their bodies had no immunity to American conditions. Malaria carried by mosquitoes, dysentery and typhoid from contaminated water, and other fevers swept through the settlements, killing large numbers in the first summer and fall. Scurvy also struck hard due to the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables on long voyages and during winters. Swollen gums, loose teeth, and extreme weakness were common until settlers learned from Native Americans to eat raw organs and certain wild plants rich in vitamin C. With almost no trained doctors available, people relied on homemade herbal remedies and knowledge passed from native tribes. Willow bark, for example, was chewed or brewed into tea for pain and fever, a natural precursor to modern aspirin. Midwives handled childbirth and basic care, while some settlers performed crude self-surgery or amputations with whatever tools they had. John Smith's strict rule in Jamestown, "He who will not work shall not eat," helped enforce discipline but also highlighted how quickly the weak or sick could be left behind. Beyond the physical suffering, the constant fear and loss led to deep despair and what settlers called melancholy, causing some to simply lose the will to live. Defense, extreme weather, and complex relations with native peoples formed another layer of daily danger. Conflicts erupted, such as the Powhatan attacks on Jamestown and the devastating King Philip's War in New England. Yet there were also long periods of trade and uneasy cooperation. Settlers defended themselves with firearms and armor that gave them an edge against arrows, while quickly learning to build wooden forts and stockades for protection. Weather posed constant threats: sudden blizzards that buried cabins, summer droughts that destroyed crops, and flash floods that swept away supplies. Over time, they adapted by adopting native skills: better tracking for hunting, reliable ways to start and keep fires even in pouring rain, and snowshoes for moving through deep winter drifts. For later pioneers crossing the plains in wagon trains, the dangers shifted to occasional raids on isolated groups, though most interactions with native tribes involved trade for horses, food, or safe passage. Survival demanded constant vigilance, quick learning, and respect for the power of both nature and the people who already knew the land. In the harsh wilderness, early Americans developed remarkable tools, skills, and a forgotten ingenuity that became essential for survival. Children learned critical abilities from a young age, including making fire with friction drills or flint and steel, tracking animals through forests and prairies, repairing broken tools with limited materials, and navigating vast landscapes using stars, rivers, moss on trees, and natural landmarks. Many early colonists arrived as gentlemen expecting easy riches, but the brutal reality forced a complete mindset shift towards self-reliance, turning them into skilled farmers, hunters, and craftsmen who could build, fix, and improvise almost anything. Community played a vital role through shared labor events like barn raisings, where neighbors gathered to construct buildings in a single day, combining muscle, food, and celebration to strengthen bonds and accomplish what one family could not alone. A common myth that these settlers were lazy or unproductive is easily busted. What appeared as laziness was often the visible effects of chronic malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion from endless physical labor in an unforgiving environment. Through constant practice and adaptation, these practical skills and cooperative spirit transformed struggling newcomers into resilient survivors who could thrive in the American frontier. The extreme hardships faced by early Americans forged some of the core values that still define American culture today. Unbreakable resilience in the face of failure, a fierce spirit of individualism and self-reliance, and a relentless drive to innovate and solve problems with whatever was at hand. Their legacy reminds us that survival and success often come from learning through deadly mistakes, adapting quickly, and never giving up. In modern times, these same principles live on in prepper communities, off-grid living enthusiasts, and anyone who values practical self-sufficiency. Simple survival tips inspired by the early settlers still work today. Learn to build a fire in wet conditions using dry tinder and a friction drill or flint. Practice basic navigation with stars and natural signs instead of always relying on GPS. Grow your own food using companion planting like the native Three Sisters method. Boil or purify all questionable water. Stock versatile long-lasting foods like pemmican-style jerky, and build strong community ties through shared skills and mutual help. By remembering the brutal lessons of Jamestown, Plymouth, and the westward pioneers, we gain timeless wisdom for facing challenges, whether in the wilderness or everyday life. The early Americans endured unimaginable suffering, deadly voyages, starving winters, disease, and constant danger. Not so they could merely exist, but so that future generations could thrive in a new land. Their story is a powerful reminder that resilience, adaptability, and raw willpower can overcome even the harshest realities. So here's the final thought. They survived so we could thrive. What harsh reality in your own life would break you? And what would it take for you to push through like they did? If this video changed how you see American history, hit the like button. Drop a comment below with your favorite survival hack you learned today. Whether it's building a fire in the rain, making pemmican, or the Three Sisters planting method. And if you want to go deeper, subscribe and turn on notifications for part 2, where we'll uncover the incredible Native American survival secrets that helped shape this nation. Thanks for watching. Stay resilient.